Audiobook Academy. Book Summary. Hard Times. By Charles Dickens. Charles Dickens' Hard Times was serialized between April and August of 1854. Dickens believed that including Hard Times in his weekly magazine, Household Words, would help boost sales. He was absolutely correct, the increase in sales was real. During a trip to Manchester, Charles Dickens was disgusted by the working conditions in some of the city's industries. He vowed to utilize any tool he had at his disposal to attract attention to the situation. For him, the weapon of choice was his pen. He used it masterfully. It is via the characters in this novel that he expresses his thoughts. Dickens' tales sparked a slew of societal shifts. For some of the plot points in this book, the author felt as if kids had been deprived of the opportunity to develop their imaginations in school. A group of people in a small industrial town are depicted in hard times as they make decisions that lead to the circumstances they face. A father who believed he had it all figured out was shocked to discover that he had made a terrible mistake. While one young woman who has a lot of love to give is able to share it with others in need, another learns how to love for the first time. All of the characters come to the same conclusion in the style of Charles Dickens. The bad guys are left to their own devices, while the good guys are provided a safe haven in which to live and spread their kindness. Book 1, Sewing. April 1, 1854. School has been closed for Hard Times opening. Education for young children is being discussed by three men. Facts and facts alone are being discussed as the students sit silently and wait to be poured into them till they were stuffed to the brim with information. There's a new school in Coketown under the leadership of Thomas Gradgrind. Children attending his school will be exposed to nothing but facts. The only thing he doesn't want is any creative thinking. Not a single one of those. In order to demonstrate the effectiveness of his teaching methods to Mr. McGoacomchild, Mr. Gradgrind decides to quiz the students. She is number 20, and he asks her to describe a horse. So far, he doesn't know who she is, he has her phone number. When he inquires about her name, she responds with Sissy Jupe as an answer. Gradgrind criticizes her for referring to him by his given name. What does her father do when she tells him she's called that by him? He inquires. She claims that her father is a horse-riding person. He goes on to suggest that he has to break horses in order to correct her more. Facing the prospect of upsetting her professor, she reluctantly agrees. He then explains that since the man appears to treat sick horses, he must be a veterinarian. Before she can answer him, he reminds her that she is Cecilia Jupe. He tells the other kids that girl number 20 is unable to define a horse because she's too terrified to speak up for herself. Then he hands the question to a youngster, Blitzer, to answer. I don't like the look of his eyes or skin. However, his definition is limited to facts, such as quadruped, 40 teeth, and so on. Sissy takes a seat, embarrassed. When Mr. Gradgrind is walking home later, he finds his two oldest children peeking out of a hole in the circus fence. He's enraged, to say the least. All of Mr. Gradgrind's children, from the moment they were born, were taught from an early age to solely deal with the facts and to avoid all forms of entertainment. When he looks over to his 16-year-old daughter Louisa and her 7-year-old brother Thomas, he sees them glued to the circus. To defend her brother, Louisa claims that she dragged him there. When Mr. Gradgrind drags them away, he asks them what Mr. Bounderby would say if he could see them, but they refuse to answer. Mr. Gradgrind's buddy, Mr. Bounderby, introduces us. Everyone admires him because he's brash and vulgar, but he's also immensely wealthy. The Gradgrind's parlor is where he is boasting about his bleak childhood at the moment. This is something he's very proud of. He was abandoned by his mother in the street and raised by an alcoholic grandmother. He's also prone to boasting about it. When Mr. Gradgrind arrives with his children in tow, he begins a conversation about his favorite subject with the ill Mrs. Gradgrind while hiding the heat from the fire. Instead of joining his companion in chastising them, Mr. Gradgrind tells him about their bad behavior. In contrast, Mr. Bounderby only chats to them in a half-hearted manner and then urges them to study. Little Miss Jupe, according to Mr. Bounderby, may be to blame for the children's misadventures. The two decide to tell her father that she is no longer allowed at the school, and Mr. Gradgrind agrees. Nevertheless, Mr. Bounderby stops by the nursery to visit Louisa before he leaves. Her father's rage has been diverted to him, and in return, he demands a kiss from her. It is evident that she is appalled by him, but she allows him to kiss her on the cheek. In order to get to the circus, Mr. Gradgrind and Mr. Bounderby leave. Sissy Jupe is being hunted by Blitzer as they make their way. Their father had sent her out for horse liniment. The two men intervene and take the girl back to her father's house. After arriving at the hotel where the circus performers are staying, she discovers that her father has been forced to leave the troupe since he is unable to perform. Gradgrind is moved by her story and decides to bring her back with him to his house. The way he used to educate his own children is what he intends to use to educate her. Without imagination, there are only facts. She only agrees because she has faith in her father's return. As long as he finds her, the circus owner will let him know where to look for her. Mrs. Sparsit, Bounderby's housekeeper, discusses Sissy with him the next day. Despite her noble background, Mrs. Sparsit's family has fallen on hard times. Despite the fact that she works for Mr. Bounderby, she never forgets about her affluent family. Mr. Bounderby is worried about Sissy's impact on little Louisa since he has already staked out Louisa as his future wife. When she's at home, Mr. Gradgrind has told Sissy that she can help out around the house and that she can continue to attend his school. Mr. Gradgrind likes to experiment on young minds, which goes against Mr. Bounderby's recommendations. Louisa's mood isn't good. Stone Lodge has no color in it. When she is alone, she can't seem to put her finger on what's wrong with her little brother, Tom. Louisa's mother cautions her from wondering about anything in particular. To wonder about things is considered fanciful by her father. In order for her to know, she needs to gather information. At school, little Miss Jupe is having difficulties. It's too difficult to focus on the numbers alone. Her thoughts frequently veer off course, and she harbors fears about her estranged father. Mr. Gradgrind tells her to keep her mind on the facts and not dwell on her father's absence. Louisa, on the other hand, finds her intriguing. Louisa has spent her entire life being taught to suppress her feelings, thus Sissy's ability to do so is particularly endearing to her. It is common for Tom to warn Sissy to be cautious during their conversations. Mr. Bounderby is not going to appreciate her inquiring into Sissy's past, and she should know better. April 29, 1854. A factory owned by Mr. Bounderby employs Mr. Stephen Blackpool. A hand is what he does. One of the lowest paying jobs in weaving is that of the weaver's weaver. He appears considerably older than he is, despite the fact that he is only 40 years old. There are wrinkles on Stephen's face. As soon as Rachel arrives, his mood brightens. She is honest, trustworthy, and compassionate. Despite the fact that they've known each other for years, he hasn't been able to communicate his feelings for her, and he's sitting on the floor of his tiny hovel as a result. Stephen is furious as he nearly trips over his wife. She's a slobbering alcoholic, and she's back. Then she orders him to get out of bed or else. He reluctantly relinquishes the bed as he sobs into his hands. He rests his aching limbs on the floor. Stephen meets with his boss, Mr. Bounderby, the following day. Stephen describes his circumstances and inquires as to whether or not he is eligible for a divorce. Mr. Bounderby tells Stephen that only the wealthy can afford a divorce after he retells the story of his destitute boyhood. He'll just have to deal with the hand life has dealt him. Stephen departs for the office after he leaves Bounderby's house. He runs upon an elderly woman who is keeping an eye on the house. Her explanation for her yearly pilgrimage to the same area in the hopes of catching a glimpse of Bounderby is simple: she lives out in the country and saves up her money all year long. Stephen, who just returned from visiting the man, is a welcome distraction as she fears he won't appear. When she joins Stephen in the factory, she raves about how beautiful it is. Rachel is the one thing that Stephen longs for when he gets home from work. Imagine how cozy their house would be in the winter. Rachel is ministering to the ailing wife of Stephen when he finally arrives home. She instructs him to take a nap in the chair. His wife appears to be taking a deadly quantity of medicine, and Stephen is awoken by the sight. Despite his indecision, Rachel steps in and removes the drug from the woman's hands. Rachel believes Stephen that she's an angel. May 13, 1854. He has determined that Sissy is failing school but can help Mrs. Gradgrind by staying with her and being a companion to her. She doesn't belong in a classroom. As a member of Parliament, Mr. Gradgrind spends much of his time in London. Since beginning his apprenticeship at Mr. Bounderby's bank as an apprentice, young Tom has become increasingly egocentric and hedonistic. He longs for her to accept Mr. Bounderby's marriage proposal since he misses her taking care of him. Mr. Bounderby will allow her to dwell there, as he has taken up residence there. Having her there, he is confident that Mr. Bounderby will not interfere with Tom and his friend's new pastime of sex and pleasure. Although Mr. Bounderby is in his 50s and Louisa is only 16, she agrees to marry him because her father insists she do so. She doesn't know if she's expected to fall in love with him. So why does it make any difference who she marries? She realized this after talking about it with her father. For the sake of her father's happiness, she agrees to it. Mr. Bounderby isn't sure if he should tell his housekeeper about his marriage. She doesn't look happy, but she agrees to look after the bank apartments he owns. Odd with his choice, he lavishes her with jewelry and other presents. However, she remains emotionless until the very last second before clutching onto her brother in fear that she is about to make a grave error. He coldly informs her, "The clock has struck 12. Goodbye." Book 2, Reaping. May 27, 1854. A year ago, Mrs. Sparsit moved into the bank. She sits at the window every day. As the bank fairy, she sprinkles the bank with her feminine charms from time to time. Enhancing the bank with a dash of elegance, however, she is regarded as the bank dragon, a guardian of the bank's treasures by customers. Tom Gradgrind's dissipation is the topic of conversation between Mr. Blitzer, a bank porter, and himself. A knock on the door interrupts their conversation. The door is opened by a dapper young man. He's a complete stranger who happened to see her sitting in the bank's window. Mr. Bounderby and his wife were on his mind, and he wanted to know if she knew them. The news that Mrs. Bounderby is young surprises Mr. Sparsit, who had heard she was quite intelligent. He intends to study politics under Mr. Gradgrind, he says. The young man's name is revealed to be James Harthouse in the following chapter. Aside from that, he is a con man. In order to alleviate his ennui, he is only present. He believes that studying politics would keep him entertained, and while he has little interest in Mr. Gradgrind's philosophy, he is willing to appear as if he does in order to keep the time passing quickly. A wonderful way to spend his time while dining with the Bounderby family is for James to talk to the young Mrs. Bounderby. After he meets her brother, he is much more interested in her. He and Tom share a few drinks, and Tom soon becomes inebriated as a result of having consumed far too much. According to him, his sister married Bounderby mainly so that she could assist him financially. That she had no feelings for him. James intends to make love to her. The labor movement is stirring elsewhere in Coketown at the moment. Hands who work at the factories are holding a meeting. Employees are demanding improved working conditions and higher wages. In spite of Stephen's attendance at the meeting, he opposes the union's existence. He fears that it could damage the relationship between the workers and their manager. Even his closest male friends agree that forming a union is a wise move. They resolve to isolate Stephen, despite the fact that they had been friends for years. With Blitzer's arrival after 4 days of being ignored, he feels relieved. He wants to know what transpired at the union meeting, but Stephen refuses to spy on it. Bounderby resigns in a fit of fury. Stephen has little choice but to leave Coketown in search of job now that all of his pals have abandoned him. Stephen sees Rachel and the elderly woman he met a year ago outside the house. Rachel is the first to learn of his job loss, and he extends an invitation to the two women to return to his home for tea. Despite the fact that he should be depressed, he had a good time with Rachel. There will be a knock on the door soon. There are two of them, Louisa and Tom. She was impressed by Stephen's honesty when she heard him inform her husband that he would do nothing to halt the nuptials. She offers to pay for his assistance, but he only accepts £2. After that, Tom approaches him and offers him another deal. A nice bargain will come to him with patients outside the bank every evening, according to this man. But nothing happens except for Mrs. Sparsit and Blitzer observing Stephen's loitering. His search for employment is now over. His mind wanders to Rachel and how much he wishes she were here with him. The majority of James' time is spent plotting Louisa's seduction. He believes he has discovered feelings in her that she is unaware of. Because her brother appears to be the only one she cares about, James devises his scheme to assail him through him. He exerts his sway over the boy in order to influence him to be kinder to his sister. Then James tells her that he is responsible for her brother's good behavior because of him. July 1, 1854. As James works on his seduction, Mr. Bounderby storms into the room. He declares that the bank has been looted of $150. It was discovered that Stephen had been lurking around the bank, which leads them to believe he is the perpetrator. The robbery has made Mrs. Sparsit so frightened that she must stay with the Bounderbys. The most of her time is spent with Mr. Bounderby, who refers to Louisa as Miss Gradgrind whenever she sees her. Stephen's innocence is Louisa's opinion. She approaches him since she is aware of his financial predicament. When she leaves, he weeps into his pillow and denies perpetrating the heist. Mrs. Sparsit is attempting to influence Mr. Bounderby by praising him and spending time with him, while seeing that Louisa is spending time with James. When Louisa receives a letter from her mother, all of these amorous games come to an end. Louisa rushes to her mother's side as she succumbs to her illness. Louisa is taken aback by how much happier Jane appears to be when she arrives. It has been Sissy's job to look after the girl. In the absence of her parents' guidance, the child is upbeat. Louisa, seated next to her mother, overhears her calling her husband, who will know what she forgot. Mrs. Gradgrind died after attempting to decipher the patterns in whatever it was she had in mind. With James in tow, Mrs. Sparsit is on a mission to catch Louisa. She can't wait to see Louisa descend the dark spiral staircase into the abyss. Mrs. Sparsit, who is suspicious, overhears the two of them having a private talk. James has declared his undying devotion to Louisa and has requested a rendezvous someplace. Wants to be her lover. In the end, he agrees to see her in town later that night, but she insists he depart right away. Mrs. Sparsit pursues Louisa into Coketown, but she gets separated from her. While she's doing this, she's picturing Louisa plummeting to her death from the top of that stairwell. Louisa, on the other hand, heads to her father's house instead. Despite the rain, she storms into his study and tells him that he damaged her by raising her based on facts alone. That poor girl is crying now. With a husband she doesn't love and James who wants her to be his lover, she is torn between the two. Then she falls on the ground, sobbing uncontrollably. It's a shock to Gradgrind, and he's ashamed of himself. His pride and his system's triumph were laid out in a heap at his feet. Book 3, Garnering. July 22, 1854. Her father's house is where Louisa lives. She's resting comfortably in her old mattress. Although he says he wishes to assist her, her father claims to lack the knowledge of the heart and hence cannot do so. Sissy, at long last, comes to her aid. In return, she offers to teach Louisa how to use her feelings and to feel love and happiness. Next, Sissy and James meet. Due to Louisa's absence, he gets agitated. His life will never be the same again and he should leave town as soon as possible, Sissy warns him. He agrees, and he leaves because of her kindness and honesty. Mrs. Sparsit manages to convince Bounderly that she saw Louisa and James, despite being sick with a nasty cold she picked up while following Louisa. When he discovers his wife at her father's house, he is enraged and dragged her out of bed. As a result, Mr. Gradgrind believes that Bounderly should leave Louisa in his care so he can help her. His wife's spouse informs him that as her lover, he should always put her needs first. Bounderly promises to return all of her belongings if she doesn't arrive home by noon the next day. He carries on his warning and resumes living as a bachelor once more. Bounderby, on the other hand, has discovered a way to vent his wrath. Stephen. He's on a mission to find the thief. Even Stephen's ex-colleagues and the union boss have their doubts about him. Even still, Rachel is still a believer. As soon as she tells Mr. Bounderby what she believes, Mr. Bounderby brings her and Tom over to Louisa's house to meet with Louisa and Stephen. In the hopes that Stephen will be vindicated, Louisa has reaffirmed her tale. Louisa's brother offers her a sneer as Bounderby and Tom depart. If Stephen doesn't show up within the week, Rachel begins to suspect that he's hiding something. While they wait for Stephen, Sissy makes a nightly visit to Rachel. They see Mrs. Sparsit dragging the elderly woman who had been minding Mr. Bounderly's house into the house one night, so he may accuse her of being an accomplice in the bank robbery. In contrast, Bounderly is enraged. They are related to each other by way of his mother. The story he's been repeating is a fabrication. She was always there for him. Her financial assistance allowed him to attend the top universities, but he fled away and invented a new life for himself. After he grew affluent, he refused to let her come visit him. When confronted in front of his co-workers, Bounderly refuses to give an explanation. August 5, 1854. Sissy tries to talk Rachel into going on a stroll with her so she can figure out what happened to Stephen. When they go looking for Stephen's hat, they come across it in the woods. The two women begin searching for missing items out of fear of being involved in an accident. Eventually, they come across him in an abandoned mine shaft. He's still here, but it's a close call. There is no time to waste. Stephen is ultimately rescued and a doctor is rushed to the scene. However, Stephen is still killed. To Rachel in his final moments, he says, "I love you," and he requests Louisa to have her father speak to Rachel's father in order to clear her brother's name. Tom has vanished without a trace. Louisa and her father learn that Sissy persuaded Tom that he could flee the circus with the help of the performers. When they find him, he's still downcast and accuses Louisa of not paying his gambling bills, which he believes she did. They try to give him money so he can get away, and she claims she still loves him. Unfortunately for him, Blitzer shows up and orders the circus performers to seize him so that he may return to court to face prosecution. Instead of assisting Blitzer, the circus performers assist Tom in order to protect Sissy. Using a boat, he flees the scene. The fact that her father is no longer alive is also revealed to Sissy. Taking a peek into the future, the book's final chapter comes to a close. Mr. Bounderby dismisses Mrs. Sparsit and orders her to spend the remainder of her life in the company of her squabbling family. Mr. Bounderby will die on the street of Coketown in 5 years after suffering a seizure. Mr. Gradgrind will no longer teach facts, but will instead devote his time and energy to religion and charitable endeavors. Louisa will never get married, but she will be an aunt to all of Sissy's children and share in their joys and sorrows as a child grows. The last thing Tom will want to do before he dies is see his sister's face. It's also likely that Rachel's generosity and friendliness will continue to spread to everyone she meets. Thomas Gradgrind, wealthy. Former wholesale hardware retailer. He and his family have landed in Coketown, a tiny industrial town in England. He is elected to the House of Representatives. He sets up a modern school to teach the ideology he has instilled in his children, which he believes in. His views are based solely on the facts. Realistic facts, no feelings, no fantasy. As a sensible man, he takes pride in his children's lack of emotional expression. He entirely alters his thinking at the end of the book, seeing the necessity of love and the error of it. Louisa Gradgrind, a lovely 16-year-old girl. She's perplexed, to say the least. She has no concept of feelings as a result of her upbringing. She has a hard time expressing her feelings and interacting with others. She has no qualms about marrying her father's 50-year-old acquaintance. She does it solely to please her father and brother. Her youngest brother is the only person she cares about. However, he is frequently callous and nasty toward her. Thomas Gradgrind Jr., his response to his father's strict upbringing is to rebel with gambling and drunkenness. He would love nothing more than to show his affection to his sister, but he is far too self-absorbed to do so. His laziness sets in when the bank hires him. That way, he'll get out of his gambling debts and get the attention he needs from his boss, who will be married to his sister. In order to pay off his debts, he steals from the bank and blames Stephen for it. Josiah Bounderby, he starts out the story as a friend of Mr. Gradgrind. Our hero's ambition to marry the man's young daughter soon makes it clear that their friendship is built on more than just platonic relations. It is claimed that Mr. Bounderby has made his own way out of poverty. Even though he claims that his mother abandoned him, his story is subsequently exposed to be a fabrication. In spite of the fact that he was born into a wealthy family, he has not shown any interest in his mother, who he claims abandoned him. Cecilia Jupe, a beautiful young girl who was raised in the circus. In the circus, her father was a performer, and her mother died when she was just a few months old. Her name is Cecilia, Sissy. She aids Louisa in discovering her own feelings. Mrs. Sparsit, a manipulative old woman. Because of her late husband's familial ties, she sees herself as superior to everyone around her. To protect herself from Mr. Bounderby, she tries to break up his relationship with his wife. Stephen Blackpool, a 40-year-old man, that looks much older because of the hardships life has given him. He puts in long hours for meager remuneration. Due to his current marriage, he cannot be with the woman of his dreams. It doesn't matter what happens, he stands firm in his beliefs. Rachel, a warm and kind woman. She has a kind of ethereal quality about her. Love for Stephen is what keeps her from getting married. When she learns about his wife's situation, she is supportive and compassionate. James Harthouse, wealthy young man that comes into town to stir things up. When he's not working, he fantasizes of a career in politics. However, he primarily does this in order to pass the time by having an extramarital romance with Louisa. In Portsmouth, England, Charles Dickens was born in 1812 and died in 1970. As a writer, he's among the most well-known in literature's long history. At the age of 7, Dickens' father was imprisoned for debts, and Charles was taken out of school as a result. He was compelled to work in a blacking warehouse, an experience that would have a lasting impact on his subsequent writing. Dickens returned to school after his father's release from prison, although his education was largely self-taught. Following graduation, he began working as a legal clerk and later as a court and parliament correspondent. In 1833, under the alias Boz, he began publishing amusing descriptions of daily life in London. Artistic illustrations accompanying each essay made it an instant success, leading to the release of the Pickwick Papers. Also, it led to the development of the serial story in London. After publishing a number of successful books and serving on editorial boards for periodicals, Dickens continued to push for social change through his humanitarian endeavors and charitable writings. Additionally, he ran a theatre group that performed for Queen Victoria and gave public readings of his writings. His success in business, however, did not translate into success at home. Despite the fact that the marriage had produced 10 children, he and his wife divorced in 1858 alleging incompatibility. A stroke took his life on June 9, 1870. He was laid to rest in Westminster Abbey on June 13 of the same year. Thank you for listening in Audiobook Academy. Don't forget to subscribe and smash that like button for more content like this. See you in next video.